the truth is fossil fuels are the greenest energy sources we have in our energy mix today.
Love and light, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of El Podcast, the greatest virtual happy hour in the world, hosted by yours truly, Kai Primo and Jesse Wright, coming to you from the beautiful island of Puerto Rico. Our guest today is Dr. Patrick Moore. He is a lifelong independent scientist and environmentalist. He was a co-founder of Greenpeace in 1971, a director for 15 years, and a leader of many campaigns. But in the mid-1980s, he became disenchanted with the positions his fellow Greenpeace directors were adopting, using misinformation, sensation, and fear for fundraising instead of using valid science. He is the author of the books Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout and Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom, exposing the fake news and fake science around 11 claims of disaster, including climate change, coral reefs, polar bears, plastic, nuclear energy, and more. So this is going to be a good one because I'm now questioning, have we been duped by environmentalist movements? And so we're about to find out. So thank you so much. Welcome, Dr. Moore. We're so delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Kai and Jesse. Kai, that was a very good introduction. It saves me having to say a lot of things. And I'm ready to go when you are. Carry on.
Let's get into this. But before we do, if you aren't subscribed on YouTube, please find us on YouTube and subscribe. And also hit the like button because it does help us bring you content like this in the future. Dr. Moore, you are one of the original co-founders of Greenpeace in 1971. Please talk about how you got involved and how it got started.
Well, from childhood, I was a nature lover. I grew up in a wilderness area on northern Vancouver Island where your playground was the tide flats, the forests, the ocean. The Pacific is like 5 minutes outside the tiny inlet. I grew up on a floating village called a float camp, and it was just a completely unique childhood. But at age 14, after having gone to a one-room schoolhouse by boat for the first 8 years, I had to be sent away because that's as far as school went in Winter Harbor. And I ended up at a boarding school in Vancouver where I was given a really first-class education and basically excelled in the life sciences and in science in general. Enrolled in the University of British Columbia in an honors Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Biology, and then went on to do a PhD in ecology before that word was even in the popular press. I think I was the first PhD ecologist in Canada, and that was my calling, was to understand how life and the great system of life works and the whole of evolution back 4 billion years or so, and the history of the Earth, the history of the extinctions of life that occurred through that history and how evolution has moved forward for these so many millions of years. I heard about a little group meeting in the church basement in Vancouver called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. And they had a small group assembled with a plan to sail a boat to the Aleutian Islands to protest U.S. hydrogen bomb testing there. And I thought, that's exactly what I want to do, is join that little group and do something instead of just sitting at a desk and learning and reading. Nothing wrong with that, but I wanted to do something to stop the threat of all-out nuclear war, which at that time, it was the height of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the threat of all-out nuclear war, and the emerging consciousness of the environment. Environment was becoming a popular word. Ecology had not yet been mentioned, but people were gathering in groups to save the environment. And so I sailed on that first voyage of Greenpeace, which is what the Don't Make a Wave Committee became eventually. And we stopped those hydrogen bomb tests. President Nixon, within a few months after the test that we protested against, canceled the remaining series. And it was really at the cusp of the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, now called Russia. And it was a momentous occasion. When that bomb went off, people from both sides of the border, the U.S. and Canada, met at the border in solidarity and closed the borders down for a whole day, again, in protest for them having set that bomb off. And we were still out on the ocean. And because we went out and did something, we got in the news. We got on Walter Cronkite's Evening News when we got arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard. And that brought the news of this protest to millions of people. And that's the way Greenpeace worked for the many years I was with it. We went on after that just to successfully drive French atmospheric nuclear testing underground in the South Pacific. We then took the issue of the great whales, 30,000 of which were still being slaughtered in the mid-1970s by big factory whaling fleets from Russia and Japan. We stopped that. We went on to stop the slaughter of 250,000 baby seals still nursing at their mothers on the ice floes off eastern Canada. We stopped that. And then we went after toxic waste, particularly in the rivers of Europe, where North America had passed pretty good pollution control for air and water in the early 70s, right around the time we were getting going. But Europe had not followed suit. And the big rivers, the Rhine, the Elbe, the Thames, were basically dead from factories dumping their waste in with pipes coming in underwater where no one could see it. So we had the riverboat campaign where we went up these rivers, identified where these pipes were, and went down with scuba gear and plugged the pipes so that the waste backed up into the factory. And that made headlines that we were doing this. And eventually that was ended. And now there are fish in those rivers where there weren't any before. By the early 80s into the mid 80s, Greenpeace had started as a volunteer organization with just a few of us. And with, we weren't being paid to do this. This was a totally volunteer operation at the beginning. By the mid 80s, we had over 500 employees on a payroll. And that kind of changes things a bit when you have to meet a payroll every month. You sort of become more like a business in many ways. And fundraising becomes paramount. Suddenly, the campaign was seen more as a fundraising effort than it was to bring about a real change in the world. And by this time now, the environmental movement had moved from green and peace being about people and about ending nuclear war or the threat of it. And the peace kind of got lost somewhere along the way, and all there was left was the green. And now the environmental movement was characterizing the human species as the enemy of nature, the enemy of the world, like as if we were all bad and all the rest of life was good. So this dichotomy is just, I can't live with a group that thinks that way. We are part of nature. We evolved with nature. We go right back to the beginning like all the rest of life does on this planet. Most people don't stop to think that every living thing on this earth today of every species represents a successful reproduction since the beginning of life, or we wouldn't be here. Extinction is when the tree of evolution is pruned so that one's gone. Whatever it was, the dinosaurs being exterminated by the asteroid that hit Yucatan 65 million years ago, they're gone, and they're not coming back. But the species that are here today, of which there are about 1.7 million, all survived through the whole history of life. Because if they hadn't given birth to the next generation, that would be the end of that lineage. So we all have to recognize that we are the successful ones. Every cockroach, every shrimp, every tree, every human represents a continuous successful reproduction since the beginning of life. And that gives you a bit of a feeling of what a miracle all of this is. And I'm not an institutional religious person, but I do believe that life is a miracle and that we don't know anywhere else in the universe where it exists. People say, well, it has to exist other places because there's so many stars and there must be so many planets and surely it must have happened somewhere else. Well, until we find out that it did happen somewhere else, we don't have any way of saying that it did. So this may be a unique situation. How do we know it isn't? And so that's the way I approach the reverence for life and all life. I know it's hard to accept viruses and bacteria that can kill you and big animals that might jump on you in the night and eat you, but they're all part of this amazing creation, and we're here right now today, and hopefully we'll be again tomorrow. So that's sort of how I think about it, and I couldn't stand the idea that we were being characterized as the enemies of nature. But on the sharp end of the stick, though, that's kind of a philosophical point. The sharp end of the stick was when my fellow directors, five and myself, so 6 of us, all of whom had long experience in the movement, they decided that we should, they all agreed, the other 5 of them all agreed that we should start a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. That would be the title of the campaign, Ban Chlorine Worldwide. None of them had any formal science education, and like I say, you don't have to be a nuclear physicist to want to stop nuclear war. You don't have to even be a marine biologist to want to save the whales. But if you're going to deal with the issue of toxics and chemistry, you have to have a bit of science. The first rule in toxicology, which is about chemicals, is that the poison is in the dose. It's sort of like the rule in medicine, do no harm. It's the maxim of toxicology. In other words, a small amount of something that is deadly at a larger dose does not necessarily hurt you at all. Your body is capable of dealing with a small amount of any poison as long as it's small enough that it doesn't overwhelm your body's defenses. Because our bodies and every organism's body has a cellular repair mechanism in it that if something challenges it, your cells actually have a way of healing themselves. And as long as your cells can heal themselves faster than they're being damaged, you're okay. It's the same with radiation as it is with chemistry. And so this banned chlorine worldwide. I'm going like you guys. Table salt is sodium chloride. It is an essential nutrient. We have to eat it or we die. All life requires sodium chloride. But if you ate half a cup of salt, just like gulped it down, it would desiccate the insides of you and you would die. So that's what it means by the poison is in the dose. But many substances which are essential at low levels are also toxic at higher levels. Then there's substances that we don't need at all, but still a small amount of them will not hurt us, whereas a larger amount of them can kill us. So I tried to explain that, and then I just went into the really important stuff, which is that adding chlorine to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health to prevent waterborne communicable diseases like cholera in swimming pools, in spas, and in our drinking water. And in addition to that, about 80% of all our medicines are made with chlorine chemistry. And about 25% of those medicines have chlorine in them. If you look at your cold and flu medicines, even widely used, you'll see a little Cl at the end of some of the ingredients in there. So this fell on deaf ears. They just thought that it was such a great campaign because chlorine gas is so poisonous, and you can look back at the fact that Germany used it in World War I as a weapon against the Allied forces, and therefore chlorine should be banned worldwide. And I left as that decision was being made. They went on to conduct that campaign for some time. They eventually dropped it because I don't think it actually worked as well as they thought it would. And also it was a lie, or based on a lie. And as time has gone on, I have watched as Greenpeace has gone from this sort of business model to becoming a racket that is basically peddling junk science to the general public, and the media just laps it up. So that's where I'm at these days. And if you've read my book, you will see that I have actually pretty much thoroughly proven that so many of these fairy tales about the polar bears going extinct and the coral reefs all dying and the plastic sea of garbage in the Pacific twice the size of Texas are also all lies. Never mind the central lie in all of this, that the Earth is going to get too hot for life, when in fact we are in one of the coldest periods in Earth's history at this present moment. This is an interglacial period, which is warmer than it was during the 40 or so glacial advances that have occurred within the Pleistocene Ice Age. People get the most recent glacial advance, which is only one of 40 that's happened during the Pleistocene Ice Age. They get that confused with the Ice Age, that's when the Ice Age ended. No, the Ice Age has not ended. We are still in the Pleistocene epoch of the world's ages, and it is one of the coldest periods in the history of life. That's why there's so much ice on the poles. Imagine if the ice came down all the way to the US border and all of Canada was covered in ice. Well, that's exactly what the situation was 20,000 years ago. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered virtually the whole of Canada, down into New York as well. New York City was covered in half a mile of ice. Montreal, 2 miles of ice. So there was nothing living there then. And how many species are in Antarctica? There's no bears there. There's birds there, but they're basically marine birds. They're feeding from the ocean, not from the ice. Ice is the enemy of life, and yet people are worried about it melting. Well, one of the reasons they're worried about it melting is sea level rise. Well, very few people realize that 20,000 years ago, when all that ice was on Canada and Russia, and Antarctica had twice as much or more ice on it then than it does even now, the sea was 400 feet lower during that glacial advance that peaked 20,000 years ago. And it had been coming on for 80,000 years, because these are 100,000-year cycles, these glacial periods that we've been going through for the last 2.5 million years. Before that, though, it was so warm that there was no ice on either pole. The Eocene thermal maximum was 50 million years ago. There was no ice on this Earth. For 200 million years before that, and for about 30 million years after that, as it began to cool, because the Earth started cooling 50 million years ago, it's very clearly known that this is the case. Anybody can look it up. But the movement that is saying that the Earth is warming and we're all going to fry is not really interested in much before 1750, when we started using fossil fuels. It wasn't really till 1850 that we were using any amount of them, and it wasn't really until 1950 that it just took off exponentially after the Second World War. And today we're burning 10 times as much as we were then. And still, the Earth has only warmed by 1 degree in the last 300 years, 1 degree Celsius for you Fahrenheit people. And so 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which isn't very much. The average annual temperature between Washington, D.C. and New York is more than that. Never mind Miami. So it isn't as if the Earth has warmed up that much, but it's made a big difference. During the Little Ice Age, which was peaked about in 1700, so 320 years ago approximately, there were crop failures and starvation because of the cold summers that occurred during those periods. And the temperature started rising again around 1700, 150 years before we really started using fossil fuels. That's when the modern warm period began. And this modern warm period is no different than the medieval warm period, the Roman warm period, the Minoan warm period. They've been in 1,000-year cycles for the last 6,000 years or so. The second half of the interglacial period called the Holocene that we are in now. So that's my perspective, you see, I could go on for hours on this stuff because of so many different periods in the history of life. But the ice age before this one ended 250 million years ago, and since then it has been warmer than it is now until now.
And how much was their payroll when you said it hit 500? Like, how much did they have to raise just to break even on their payroll, their expenses?
When I left, I believe we were bringing in $100 million a year, much of which was going to an offshore bank account in Turks and Caicos, which they probably still have, with a lot of money in it. So that's when it just went into something that I didn't want to be associated with, because if I was going to be in a business making things that were useful, that would be different. But now I was in a business where false claims were being peddled to raise money in the name of the environment. And that is why I always like to have a little ditty. It's called renewable, clean, sustainable, and green. Those 4 words. A lot of people think they basically all mean the same thing, save the environment or whatever. But they're not the same thing. They have very distinct meanings. The first one is renewable. That means self-replicating. Wind turbines and solar farms are not self-replicating. The solar energy is renewable, and the wind is renewable because it's produced largely by solar energy. But the technology used to turn that into electricity is not renewable. A tree is renewable. All the plants and animals, all of life is renewable because it renews itself. It doesn't have to be created in a factory or a laboratory. So calling wind and solar renewable is false in that sense. And I could go on about that for about half an hour, but I'll go to clean. So I did renewable, self-replicating. Clean means not polluted. It means not toxic, not poisonous. But that doesn't mean there isn't a teeny bit of some substance there that you'd rather not have there, but it's not doing any harm because it's so low. So clean means unpolluted, but that's a kind of a general term, I guess a relative term, because there's contamination everywhere, if you want to call it that. But if it isn't harming anything, there's no point in worrying about it, because you want the contamination, if there is some, to be so low that it isn't causing any measurable harm to anything. And so that's clean. That is clean, right? You won't get every molecule of everything off, whatever it is you want it off, but you'll get it clean enough. So clean means clean enough in that sense. Sustainable means will last a long time at the present rate of use. Now, a long time is also a relative term. You could mean 5 weeks, you could mean 5 years, you could mean 5 centuries, etc. by a long time. But that's generally what it means. In other words, iron ore is sustainable. Iron is sustainable, even though it's not renewable, because there's so much of it in the Earth's crust, it'll never run out. So that's the difference between renewable and sustainable. Because if you over-harvest a fish stock, it's renewable, but that's not sustainable if you over-harvest something that's renewable. So you come now to green. That is a completely undefinable term. The other terms I was able to give you relative definitions of what they mean, and you can apply that to any number of situations. But green is a marketing term, sort of like organic with food. All food is organic. So they're using a word to describe food which is produced by a certain method, as if that food is sort of better because it's organic. But all food is organic. So it's a marketing term in a grocery store to get you to buy it because for some reason it must be better if it's called organic. But so are the other carrots, which are not called organic. They are organic too. So green is so undefinable that it can be used to market just about anything. And it's being used to market the huge investment in wind and solar energy today. Now, the Goldman Sachs top energy guy who's looking at energy around the world and the trends in energy announced just the other day that we have now spent $3.8 trillion on wind and solar globally. That's trillion, not billion, and that fossil fuel consumption has gone from 82% of our energy to 81% of our energy. And even more amusing than that is that now 81% today is more than what 82% was 10 years ago, because the total amount of fossil fuels has increased over that 10-year period. And we've spent 3.8 trillion on wind and solar energy as if that was going to reduce our fossil fuel consumption, which it has done nothing to do.
Yeah, I was reading that solar and wind, since they're variable energy sources, that the coal industry really likes them because you can't use nuclear power with solar and wind because it's so variable that you have to fire up a coal plant as soon as the wind stops blowing or as soon as the sun goes down. Is that true?
Well, with nuclear plants, the ones we have now, it is true. You can't just fire them up and shut them off. They have to keep running, and most of them have to keep running at full capacity all the time. They don't have a throttle on them like you can have with other technologies. But even coal, if you want coal to back up wind, you have to keep it hot all the time. Like you have to keep it burning, not full power, but powering up a coal plant to deal with the cloud coming over the sun and just shutting off the electricity from the wind farm, from the solar farm, or if the wind just dies. You can't do that with either coal or nuclear very easily. That's why so many gas plants have been built in recent decades, since we started building wind and solar. Gas plants can turn on and off almost in a blink. And
right.
They are really easy to take up and down. And the other one that works really well is hydro. Most big hydro dams have like 10 or so turbines. So they can run 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 or 10 turbines. They can shut the other ones down. So they're really flexible in terms of how much power they're putting out. And they can back up wind and solar fairly well. But there aren't enough, hydroelectric power is very sensitive to location. If it's flat and there's no rain, you take Denmark has lots of rain, but it's flat as a pancake. So you can't have hydro dams there. I'm lucky to live in British Columbia, where there's so many mountains and so much rain that we get 95% of our electricity from hydroelectric dams. But on the other hand, there's only about 4.5 million people here in a place twice the size of France. So there is no possibility that wind and solar can be of very much use in reducing fossil fuel consumption. As a matter of fact, if all the cars are electrified, we would have to increase our electricity supply by nearly double what it is now to provide all the fuel in the form of electricity for charging batteries in cars. I mean, I'm totally okay with electric cars, but to mandate them so that everybody is required to have an electric car is pretty ridiculous. I mean, it isn't actually going to be possible to do that, especially when people are shutting down their nuclear plants and coal plants now. When they shut down the coal plants, in some cases, they're not only that, they're demolishing the coal plant. Like, maybe they should leave it there just to see whether they really don't need it or not in the future. But in many cases, it's like some kind of religious rite to take the bulldozers in and destroy it, which also costs money. They didn't need to do that. They could have just left it there and mothballed it. So that's my take on that. Net zero is a pipe dream. And so long as we attempt to pursue it, we will impoverish ourselves further. Because that $3.8 billion has done virtually nothing to improve anything, if that was going to be an improvement in the first place to replace fossil fuels. And this is where I think I should come to my primary point that I want to challenge everybody on out there, is that the truth is fossil fuels are the greenest energy sources we have in our energy mix today. If you want to use the word green to mean environmental, Why is that? Because all the fossil fuels were made with solar energy. They were made with renewable solar energy. The coal was made from trees, forests, but mostly they are trees. And the oil and gas was made from marine animals and plants that fell to the bottom, became part of the sediment, and over millions of years turned into oil and gas. Now you'd say, well, Texas isn't a sea, but it was, and so was Alberta. And those are two of the biggest oil and gas deposits in the world. They were a sea bottom at one time. That's why they're so flat. All the prairies. North America was two continents at one time, the western part and the eastern part. And the Great Plains were an inland sea, a huge inland sea. And there the oil and gas was made from millions of years of species dying and falling to the bottom and becoming part of the sediment. So that's one green side of fossil fuels, that they were made with solar energy and they were made with life, from life. They come from life. They come from renewable energy. So in that sense, they are a form of renewable energy, not looking at the future so much as looking at how they were created. In addition to that, when we burn them, the two main things that are produced are carbon dioxide and water, because they are hydrocarbons. And we add oxygen from the atmosphere. As we all know, oxygen is necessary for fire. And the carbon and the hydrogen turn into CO2 and H2O. The H in the hydrocarbon turns into water, and the C in the hydrocarbon turns into carbon dioxide. The two main foods for all life on Earth are CO2 and water, H2O. So when we burn the fossil fuel, and with our pollution control devices now, we can make coal plants as clean as they need to be for human health and environmental health. That is proven all over the world. And whereas originally coal plants didn't have any pollution control on them, so some unburnt hydrocarbons were coming out of there. Soot, in other words, which is not healthy for people who are breathing in the air. But that's not the case any longer with these technologies. Gas plants are as clean as a whistle. The beauty of gas is that because it is a gas, it can be cleaned after it's removed from the ground. A lot of natural gas has quite a lot of sulfur in it. And you might see big piles, yellow piles of sulfur at some ports where it's being exported to make sulfuric acid for industry, etc. Most of that sulfur is coming from the cleaning of natural gas being pumped out of the ground. And if there's any other impurities in it, the water, the carbon monoxide, other things, they can be taken out of it too. So when you burn natural gas, you're burning pretty well pure CH4, which is methane, which is natural gas. And that turns into carbon dioxide and water when you burn it. That's all it turns into. And so what is not green about that? That fossil fuels were made with solar energy from life, and when they're burned, they produce the two most important foods for all of life on Earth. And that is why the Earth is greening now. We can see it over the last 50 to 60 years, a huge increase in the rate of growth of plants worldwide. The trees, the crops. NASA knows this. If you go to NASA, Greening of the Earth, you will see the global map that they have produced showing, in some cases, a 30% increase in the growth of plants on a global basis. China and India, between the two of them, have planted half the new forest area compared to the whole rest of the world. They've had huge programs in reforestation of lands that were previously deforested. My favorite statistic, though, is about Europe, Western and Eastern Europe. By about 1800, maybe 1750, 1800, around in there, the forests of Europe had been reduced to less than 10% of the total area of Europe because wood was the primary fuel. This is before fossil fuels became a primary fuel. If it wasn't for fossil fuels, there wouldn't be many trees left in this world by now. It would have been a totally different situation. But fossil fuels replaced most of the wood that was being used for fuel in steel mills, in all the buildings, for steam engines, for you name it. Trains were using wood for fuel, and boats too. When steamboats came in, they were still using wood for fuel, and eventually turned to coal. So between then and now, which is only a little more than 200 years, Europe has 43% forest cover today. And they're all native trees, growing beautifully diverse with wildlife and birds. That's one thing about forestry that's quite different from agriculture with single crops, is the foresters don't mind other species being in the forest. Whereas a farmer is worried about just about every bird and bug there is because they're going to try and eat his crops. So in that sense, farms are not particularly biodiverse, so that's why it's a good idea to have forests around them. And if you fly over the Midwest of the United States, you will see that most farms have forest areas that they keep either for firewood or because they're growing sugar maples or one thing or another. They usually have areas of forest. It's true there are vast areas of corn, and then you come to the thing that they're using corn to make fuel and then saying it's better than oil, when in fact it isn't better than oil. Oil is also made from plants, only it was made by nature rather than being grown in a farm. And so that's why I say that fossil fuels are the greenest energy sources we have today, and they account for 80% plus of our total energy use, and there's nothing wrong with that, except they are a limited resource. That is why I'm in favor of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Nothing to do with climate change. But because they are essential for certain energy uses like aircraft, for example, and huge trucks and machines in the farms and that, you're never going to run those with batteries, and you're certainly not going to run airplanes with batteries. So save the fossil fuels for things that can't be done without them, and turn other technologies, like all trains can be electrified. They don't need to be diesel powered. All ships can be electrified. If Russia can have 6 icebreakers in the Arctic that are nuclear, and 6 nuclear navies can have submarines that go underwater for 3 months with 100 nuclear warheads on them, surely a cargo ship or an oil tanker could be run by nuclear propulsion. We've been doing it for 60 years or more with the nuclear navies we have. So that can be done. We don't need to use fossil fuels for all the big shipping. It's only 2% of our energy consumption, but every 2% means 2% less fossil fuels being used. Every building can be completely operated by nuclear power. Every building. And therefore we don't have to use fossil fuels for buildings, because the fact is, I've mentioned mobile things, airplanes can't be, you can't use batteries for those. And you can't use nuclear energy very easily for an aircraft either. But you can use it for trains and ships, even though they're mobile. You can also use it for cars if you want to increase the amount of electricity you're producing, and nuclear would be another way to do that, because cars are charged when they're stationary. So if we think of it in that way, we can probably replace 75% of the fossil fuels we're using today with nuclear energy, because buildings use between 30 and 40% of all our electricity, and they can be 100% supplied with nuclear electricity for both heat, light, cooling, and appliances. Everything inside those buildings can be run on nuclear power. So we got 440 nuclear plants in the world today. More than 100 of those are between the US and Canada. The US has 95 or so operating, and Canada has 6 or 8. And so 440 or so are operating worldwide. China, Russia, and India are full speed on nuclear, building new nuclear plants by the 10s and 20s. And the West is shutting them down, which is stupid, because it just means we have to use more fossil fuels, because wind and solar will never fill the gap. That's my firm belief.
How do we get to that point? I mean, like, I tried to, when I worked at Roundtable Media, I tried to have you on, and, we were emailing back and forth, and we were all set. And then the executive producer, Rob Nelson, basically said no, that you lied about being a member of Greenpeace. I believe that in 2007, I think Greenpeace took you off their website as a co-founder. They tried to cancel you. It seems like if you read your books, like everything that you say is logical, and you actually have a PhD, you're actually a scientist. I mean, how did we get to the point where a 16-year-old high school student named Greta Thunberg, who has no training in complex topics that involve meteorology and climatology and physics and chemistry, how did she somehow become this reputable person, and a guy in his 70s who spent his entire life dedicated to the environment and actually has not just wrote about it, but has lived it? How is someone like yourself not a credible person? Like, I was, I got into, many arguments with him over that interview, but I'm like, I feel like I can't trust a lot of the stuff in the media when you have a 15-year-old girl as the spokesperson.
Well, I've been on Twitter for a long time, and I stayed on despite the fact that they have these stupid shadow bannings and things. But I've managed now to garner over 122,000 followers. And the people who are critical of me, they do it in just a name-calling way. They never provide anything substantial to back up what they're saying. It's, I had an interview once with this totally hostile French journalist. And I had stated previously in an interview with him that a person could drink a glass of glyphosate, which is Roundup, which is the herbicide that Monsanto produces, that a person could drink a glass of that and it would not harm them. And this is true, because glyphosate is actually less toxic than vinegar. And you can drink quite a bit of vinegar without harming yourself too. It's not advisable, and glyphosate, of course, is not a beverage, it is a herbicide. But I made that point just to point out the fact that all these things about glyphosate causing cancer in everybody, and I mean, and if you get into a proper discussion with people, that you'll end up, they just go, Monsanto! And that's the end of the argument. So it's pretty irrational. But I got into an interview with him where he surprised me by holding out a glass of something and said, "You said it would be okay to drink a glass of glyphosate. Why don't you drink this then?" And I said, "No way." I said, "First, I don't know who you are. I don't know what's in that glass." But that clip was taken and used as evidence that I had been lying about the toxicity of glyphosate because I was scared to drink it after I'd said it would not harm you. And that made Time magazine, and all of a sudden I was a Monsanto consultant. And I've never worked for Monsanto or any other organization like that. I've been pretty much independent all my life. I have been an environmental consultant to help people who are trying to deal with lies being spread about them. And just for example, let's look at the giant garbage patch in the Pacific, which CNN says is twice the size of Texas and growing 16 times faster than we used to believe. Wherever they got that from, I don't know. There is no Pacific garbage patch. It simply does not exist. It isn't there. And when you show pictures of the Pacific Ocean from satellite that have been put together by the German satellite that's looking at the whole world every day, people come up to me after I explain all this and show them that all of the pictures of the Pacific garbage patch are photoshopped. Someone takes the Pacific Ocean and draws a thing on it and points an arrow at it and says, "This is the Pacific garbage patch," when it isn't actually a photograph. It's photoshopped.
And what are they trying to accomplish? What are they trying to accomplish by having that narrative out there of this giant plastic floating trash heap in the ocean?
Yeah, go ahead, Kai.
I would think that there's plastic out there. It's just a little more scattered, that it's not an actual patch. But I mean, do we agree that there's definitely plastic out there floating around?
Yes, there is, just like there's driftwood out there floating around. And for some reason, people get the impression that plastic suddenly becomes toxic when it ends up in the ocean. But it doesn't. There's a reason why we wrap most of our food in plastic and contain it in plastic, is because it's to protect it from contamination, just to protect it. And that's the best way to protect it, because plastic is entirely non-toxic. It has nothing toxic in it. But plastic is made from fossil fuels. The war on plastic is proxy for the war on fossil fuels. But you see people demonstrating against an oil rig in kayaks made of plastic, wearing all plastic clothing and having a plastic paddle in a plastic kayak. Their whole being is plastic. And yet they are protesting plastic in front of an oil rig. It's completely irrational, the whole thing, because plastic in the ocean actually has two beneficial effects. Now, fish nets are a different story, but it's not because they're plastic, it's because they're nets. And fishermen, when their nets become damaged, tend to throw them overboard because they don't want them anymore, and they take up room on a small boat where they want to have the fish taking up the room, not the plastic. And they're good nets taking up the room, not the damaged nets. So it would be a good idea if we could get fishermen to stop throwing their nets overboard, because then the nets catch fish. But, okay, the nets catch some fish, then something will eat the fish that the nets catch. So it's part of the food chain in that way. It's a bit of a distorted part of the food chain, because there weren't nets floating around in the water millions of years ago. But there were lots of other ways that the food chain worked millions of years ago too. But I would say that's something that we should focus on, is to figure out how to get fishermen to bring their nets back to the dock and either have them recycled or burned for energy or whatever. But it's a very minor point. The main point is that every piece of plastic that is floating in the sea is a habitat for creatures to lay their eggs on, to attach themselves to and grow, like barnacles. You see a lot of pieces of plastic coming ashore that are covered in marine life. I've got pictures of them in my book. And the fact is, some species of wood are more toxic than plastic, like red cedar and redwood, for example, have quite strong toxins to prevent them from being attacked by fungus and insects. They produce these toxins in the wood. That's why it lasts so long outdoors, these durable woods, as we call them. It's because they contain toxic substances that make it so they don't decay. The decay would be being caused by fungus and other such species that eat wood. Whereas the plastic in the sea is purely non-toxic. And many species attach themselves to it or eat the things that are attached to it. In other words, it becomes part of the life cycle in the ocean, just like a piece of driftwood. I mean, I think people don't like plastic because to them it looks unsightly, and it's also colored, whereas driftwood is the color of wood. I guess that doesn't offend anybody.
Yeah, we've also seen
these are
a
not.
Lot of,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, my apologies. They show a lot of photos of seals getting choked by plastic, and to make you feel bad about yourself about using plastic. What are your thoughts on that?
They are exceptional, and the straw in the turtle's eye was staged, and the plastic in the gut of the baby albatross is staged. Many of these are staged, and the whole Pacific garbage patch is staged. The only picture I've seen that is actually of a huge patch of garbage in the ocean, and it says right under it, part of the Pacific garbage patch. But I looked at the photograph carefully, and I could see mountains in the background. Well, there are no mountains in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So I did some research and found out that this was the debris from the tsunami in Japan that killed 20,000 people while it washed whole towns into the ocean. So they were taking advantage of the death of 20,000 people from the tsunami to blame plastic for this, right? It wasn't really a sea of plastic. It was a sea of just broken up debris, some of which was obviously plastic because there's lots of plastic around. But most of it was buildings that had wood probably, and all broken up into smithereens. So they said that was the Pacific garbage patch, but that was the only real photograph showing a big garbage patch. Now, it's true I've been to Indonesia and seen where the the vendors who are on the banks of rivers, that's where they like to be, because they can throw all their rotten food and the plastic packaging into the river. And so I've seen a lot of river mouths with a lot of plastic in them. But when that goes out to sea, it gets dispersed over hundreds of thousands of square miles. And it does not interfere with anything. But the other amazing thing, aside from providing habitat, plastic is of different shapes than driftwood, like a plastic cup or a plastic bottle. Greenpeace showed a picture of a plastic cup that was in the water column. It had a crab inside it. And Greenpeace says that the crab is trapped in the plastic cup. No, the crab was using the cup as a home, as habitat, as shelter. And there's lots of shapes of plastic, like bottles and cups, that if they sink to the bottom, they can be used as shelter. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's not too many cup-shaped things in the ocean, or bottle-shaped things in the ocean, other than glass as well. A glass bottle on the bottom of the ocean. There's all kinds of things that go in through the neck of the bottle and find shelter in there. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is the more interesting one, and that is the marine birds, such as albatross. All birds feed hard objects to their chicks when they're in the nest to act as a digestive aid in the gizzard. Birds don't have teeth, cannot chew their food. Therefore, when they're given large whole pieces of food, it goes into their gizzard, which is a second stomach. They also have a stomach similar to ours, which is an acid stomach, where acid is excreted into it and it digests the food. But that's for the soft food and the small food. If a whole squid is fed to an albatross chick, it goes to the gizzard, which is a muscular stomach that goes like this, with hard objects in it to help grind the food to smaller pieces and be digestible. Birds on the land use pebbles for this. They give their chicks pebbles in their beak. They come with a mouthful of pebbles and say, here's your gizzard pebbles for this month. They don't have to do it every day, but it does have to be done regularly because these pebbles wear out from the grinding they're doing. Seabirds have no gravel to collect. So all the seabirds who nest on islands way out in the ocean, their best choice is pieces of pumice, which is floating lava from undersea volcanoes. So they look for pieces of pumice, which are very abrasive because they're rocks that are full of holes. So they're like a abrasive material. That's what they want. But there's not always pumice available because there's not undersea volcanoes erupting every day. But they take that if they can find it. The next thing they'll look for is small pieces of driftwood that are hard, like a knot from a tree that's been worn down so that it's a hard piece of wood. Or they will look for nuts, like an acorn-type nut that has come off a plant living by the sea or washed down a river and gone out to sea. They'll use that nut as the hard object. And for the past 50 or 60 years, they have been using hard bits of plastic of the appropriate size and shape to give to their chicks. David Attenborough, however, says that adult albatross are feeding plastic bags to their chicks, mistaking it for food. There is no evidence anywhere of an albatross feeding a plastic bag to its chick. There's only one picture I was able to find, and it is of an albatross giving a mouthful of bits of hard plastic. That's all it's got. As you can see, there's 6 or 8 different colored pieces of hard plastic about this big that are being given to the chick. I've got that photograph in my book. And this is a digestive aid. It's a positive thing that the plastic is being used for, something that the bird needs. And adult birds are not stupid enough to give them a plastic bag to digest their food with, or a sharp object. He also infers, Attenborough infers, that sharp objects are being given, and they show pictures of this. Let me just, well, here's the Pacific Ocean, and you can see Hawaii, but you can't see any Pacific garbage patch. This is a real satellite photograph over a period of a year, so that they've taken all they they've shot it so that there's no clouds showing. There's always clouds somewhere over the Pacific. So they do a composite, which then pieces together all the places where they didn't have clouds that day. But
if it was the size of Texas, we would see it.
this is a small plastic float with pelagic gooseneck barnacles growing on it. Nothing wrong with that. It's habitat. But more importantly, this is on the internet, and they say that this is a albatross chick that was cut open to show how much plastic it had been fed. You couldn't get that much plastic in a bird's gizzard. They've done this on purpose. They've staged it. And you see there's a sharp pointed object in there. No bird would feed that to its chick. They wouldn't. This is just complete garbage. Well, that's what it is. It's plastic garbage that's been staged into a dead bird's body. See, the adult birds have to eat plastic all their lives too, because they have a gizzard. But the chicks can't go and get it for themselves. That's why the adults bring it back to the nest until the bird fledges. And it's true that the chick gets more grinding pieces in it when it's in the nest, when it doesn't have to fly. Because when you have to fly, you have to be fairly lightweight. And through their lives, birds put smaller amounts of this in, but the parents want that bird to get out of that nest. And so they give it plenty of hard objects, but nothing like what is shown in that picture. There's so much fakery around this plastic story, it's unbelievable. But the main fakery is there is no giant Pacific garbage patch twice the size of Texas. It doesn't exist. And plastic is not harming the sea life to any extent, and in fact is beneficial as habitat and as grinding agent in the gizzard of marine birds, of which there are millions. And, you know, they say that birds are going extinct. Here's the crab that's trapped in the cup. Right, that's what Greenpeace says, but actually it's living in the cup. Yeah, here's the picture of the albatross giving plastic bits to its chick. And you can see they're not sharp, pointy things. They've been rounded by the sea motion in the sea and stuff like that.
So
and,
what's
here's the population of the Laysan albatross from about 1900 to now. The feather trade was when people went out and killed the seabirds for their feathers for ladies' hats and stuff around 1900. And since that ended, the albatross population has done nothing but grow. And as you can see that it's actually probably leveling off at the present time there. And,
so what's the agenda then? Like, is this just for them to raise funds, or do you think that there's something with like the World Economic Forum? I mean, they're talking about, you know, having a carbon limit at some point for people, or a carbon allowance, or I mean, what's the main agenda, or is there several things at play here?
Fear, guilt, control. Those are the three main words I'd say that are in play here. And so if you keep the public fearful and you make them guilty about their own actions, I say you're driving down the freeway in your SUV, you're afraid you're killing your grandchildren, and that makes you feel guilty. So you give Greenpeace a big check. And what are they going to do about it? Except make a lot of BS. They're not doing anything to stop using fossil fuels. They're just trying to scare people into giving them money. And so that's what's happening today. And that isn't how it started. It started with very noble intentions and volunteers who understood that we needed to stop the escalation of the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. We needed to stop killing the great whales, which were being driven into almost extinction levels over the 100 years or so that they were massacred. And now they are all growing back into larger populations. Every species of whale that was hunted down to low levels is coming back. The blue whales, the humpback whales, the gray whales are already probably at their maximum carrying capacity on the west coast of North America. And it's a wonderful thing to have been part of. But when I left, it was because Greenpeace was about to adopt a worldwide campaign to ban one of the most important elements in the periodic table, which is chlorine. All of the halogens, which are fluorine, bromine, chlorine, iodine, and adenosine, are very powerful disinfectants and bactericides. In other words, they're very poisonous as elements, and we should not be drinking them. But when I was a kid, iodine was the most important thing in the medicine chest, and I lived in a remote village with no nurse, no doctor, nobody who had any health care education. But you knew that when you got a cut, you put iodine on it and then put a bandage over it, and that would prevent the infection from bacteria and pus and further damage to yourself. It was simple, and it worked. And chlorine is not, it's not what you should put on a cut. The thing about the iodine was it was in a stage that was still liquid, but it wasn't a runny liquid. It was quite a thick liquid. And so it was the perfect consistency to use. I'm not sure if it obviously probably wasn't pure iodine. It must have been a compound of iodine of some sort. In the same way that sodium chloride is a compound of chlorine, it's called table salt. And we need to eat it. It has to at least be in our foods, or we can add it to our foods. And that's why Gandhi went to the sea and made salt, because the British were taxing salt so heavily that it was very hard on the poorest of people. And Gandhi recognized that people required salt for their survival and did this protest to try to get the tax taken off. I don't know if he was successful or not. I know he was beaten for doing something along those lines at one point, and put in jail. And, he is a great role model for bringing about social change and doing it peacefully, which he did when he made salt. Yes.
Dr. Moore, I wanted to ask about the anti-human movement and why it's become so successful. I've read that the UN Climate Summit is about to begin in Egypt in about 4 days. Hundreds of countries joining together to discuss global warming, and that global warming is caused by human activity and what we can do to stop it. What is the agenda here?
Well, it's a purely political movement, this movement. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is part of the United Nations apparatus. It's a joint venture between the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, and the United Nations Environment Program, based in Nairobi. Those two. The meteorological side of it is quite a bit more reasonable, but they have to play along with the higher up levels of this. And not many people know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's constitution or remit does not include natural effects on climate. It only includes human effects on climate. So if they concluded that humans were not the primary cause of climate change, there'd be no use for them. So they have to find that humans are the main cause of climate change in order to continue their existence. They actually have said, though, twice in their large reports that nobody reads. They read the summary for policymakers, which always omits this particular statement. They said very clearly that because global climate is multifactorial, in other words, there are many factors involved, non-linear, in other words, everything isn't just straight line calculations, it's non-linear, and chaotic. That's probably the most important word. Because chaos cannot be seen through. Chaos is a very important concept. It basically means unpredictable. And therefore, what the UN was saying, they said, because of those three things, that it's multifactorial, nonlinear, and chaotic, therefore future climate states cannot be predicted. Those are the precise words they used. And then they go ahead and predict them with computer models, which are basically, you put your assumptions into the computer and out comes the result of your assumptions at the end, right? So if you think that CO2 causes warming, that's what the computer will tell you. And if you think that it'll cause more warming, then the computer will tell you it'll cause even more warming. So computers are not a crystal ball, a computer model. They make it out as if the computer model is actually able to predict the future, when it is not able to predict the future in any way. All it predicts is your assumptions coming true. The crystal ball is a mythical object. It is not real. There is no crystal ball, as like in the Holy Grail. These are mythical objects. It's fine to have myths, but you should know which ones are myths and which ones are truths. So we have no way of knowing the future of the Earth's climate other than to look to the past. If you can see cycles behind you, and that you appear to be in part of one of those cycles now, which those of us who don't believe that humans are the main cause of this call it the modern warm period. Because coming out of the little ice age, which came to its lowest point in temperature around 1700, there has been a warming. And it just so happens that that coincides with an increase in CO2 in the global atmosphere caused by human emissions of CO2. That in no way proves that the CO2 is causing the warming, any more than it proves that the warming is causing the CO2. You know, in a cause-effect relationship, one thing is the cause and the other one is the effect. And the problem with the warming theory of CO2 is that if you go back in time, where we know what the level of CO2 was and we know what the temperature was back hundreds of millions of years, we know when the other ice ages happened. The Karoo Ice Age began in 350 million years ago and didn't end until 250 million years ago. In other words, it was 100 million years long when the Earth was in a really cold state like it is today. And that's where the great irony in all this is the Earth is in one of the coldest climates in the history of life today, in the history of modern life. This is not a warm period. That's why there's ice on the poles. And let's just, one of the funniest things about this, and I don't mean in haha so much as I mean in amazing, is that polar bears obviously could not exist if there weren't ice on the Arctic Ocean. That ice has only been there for 2 million years or 3 million years. In other words, polar bears could not have existed before 2 or 3 million years ago. They were not here. Why are they here? Because the ice came and covered the Arctic Ocean, and the Eurasian brown bear, which in North America we call it grizzly bear, but they're the same species. The Eurasian brown bear, because the ice started approaching the north shore of Russia and Europe during the cold winters, went out onto the ice and found that you could hunt seals there and turned into polar bears. So part of the population of the Eurasian brown bear, this is called divergent evolution, where one species turns into two because they are now in two completely different habitats, where on the ice it makes sense to have white fur. So over 1 million years or so, the brown bear turned into a white bear. And it makes sense to have a diet, a dietary system that is more towards carnivorous. And that's what happened to the polar bear. And because those seals are 300 pounds, the polar bear is half again as big as the Eurasian brown bear, because the Eurasian brown bear is basically eating berries and small animals, whereas the polar bear is eating great big animals that they have to pull out of the hole in the ice. So there you have it. If it wasn't for climate change, there'd be no polar bears, period. And there is no threat to them now because there's lots of ice. People don't realize that the Arctic, wonder if I can find that here quickly. The Arctic is still covered with a massive sheet of ice. Oh no, it's probably further back here. A massive sheet of ice in the winter. There isn't a square inch of the Arctic Ocean that isn't still frozen over during the winter when there's no sunlight for 6 months in the Arctic. There's no shortage of ice for the polar bears anywhere yet, or no indication that there ever will be. It's true that in the summer, when the sun is shining 24 hours a day for 6 months, the ice shrinks to a much smaller area, but it still takes up about half the Arctic Ocean. And there's lots of open water in the Arctic in the summer. That's a good thing, because if the Arctic was covered in ice year-round, which it may well have been during the most recent glacial advance, it was probably a lot harder to be a polar bear, because when the water is open, the sunlight can reach the ocean and promote the growth of plankton, which is the basis of the food chain in the sea. Those polar bears are not eating food that was grown on the land. They are eating food that was grown in the sea. And so when the ice covers the Arctic in the winter, the sun over the summer has produced a lot of plankton and zooplankton and fish and seals. And therefore they have lots to eat in the winter. So it's a very perfect cycle, but people think the polar bear is going extinct, when in fact, I speak in big audiences quite often, and I ask them this question: how many of you have heard of the treaty that was signed by all polar nations in 1973 to end the unrestricted hunting of polar bears? Almost never does anyone put up their hand, because no one is told that. And it's true, though, that there was a treaty signed because wildlife biologists came to the governments in the early 70s and said the polar bears are being overhunted. It's getting too easy for rich people to go up there in a plane and hire an Inuit guide and bring back some polar bear rugs. And so that was ended, and all countries have abided by it. And in 1973, there were somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 polar bears in the Arctic. Today, there's somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000. And they're all fat and happy. This is the truth. And it's known to be the truth. Coca-Cola never told us that in their ads in which they expropriated and abused the polar bear. They should have told us about that and given us a happy story. Instead, they show a polar bear swimming, saying this polar bear may drown. Do you think a polar bear gets in the water and not knows where it's going? You know, they just swim off into the horizon? No. There's a reason why their nickname is sea bear, in fact. They're really, really good swimmers. And when they jump in the water to go swimming, they know where they're going, to the ice floe across the way. You never see a photograph of a drowned polar bear. Now, it isn't as if a polar bear could drown and have a mishap, but there's no doubt that a lot more people drown than polar bears do.
The name of your book, I mean, is perfectly titled, because it's called Fake Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. You will perish in flames. Right, and like you're saying, like every thing that they talk about in the mainstream media, like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, how it's disappearing. I mean, how many people have been to the Great Barrier Reef? I mean, I lived in Australia for a year. I didn't even know many Australians that went to the Great Barrier Reef. You're talking about the polar bears, and then like you talk about in the book, I mean, they villainize CO2 because it's invisible. Like, oh, CO2 is going up. Okay, how do you know? Well, they said on the news. Like, did you measure it? Yeah. I mean, And the same thing with the floating island, or the floating trash island that you talked about. I mean, how many people have been there? Even if it existed, how many people would actually know and be there?
The real thesis of my book, I should explain, is that not just most, but all the scare stories today, whether it's the coral reef or the polar bear or the CO2 or the radiation or the supposedly bad thing in GMOs, which actually doesn't exist because it doesn't have a name, and everything has a name. But CO2 is real and radiation are real, and they are also invisible. So you can't see what they're doing with your own senses. Polar bears and coral reefs are remote. So invisible and remote might as well be the same thing. And the reason I use the little old man standing on a street corner saying, "You will perish in flames," I stole that from Ghostbusters. And but it makes more sense for this issue then the end is nigh, which is what people used to stand on a street corner with. But you will perish in flames is basically what the environmental movement, the climate change movement is saying, that the earth is going to get too hot for life. And people will die by the hundreds of millions from it being too hot. It's such a load of hogwash. We are, in fact, a tropical species. Did you know that, Greenpeace? The human species evolved at the equator, where it's hot. Always has been. And we could never have left there if it weren't for fire, shelter, and clothing. That's the only reason we can live in the climates we're in today. In the subtropical regions, humans could not have survived. Like, I have a place in Baja in Mexico. We're right on the Tropic of Cancer there, so we're just inside the tropics. You couldn't live there if you didn't have clothing and shelter and fire and heat. You know, it is just phenomenal that people don't understand that we're not an Arctic species. Polar bears are an Arctic species, and if the ice melted completely and there was no more opportunity for them to hunt seals on the ice in the winter, their population would decline. They may well disappear like other species have in the past when the climate has changed radically. But mostly the extinctions have been caused by asteroids. I don't know about the ones way, way long ago, but we do know that the dinosaur extinction was caused by an asteroid striking Yucatan and sending billions of tons of material up into the stratosphere, where it stayed for a long, long time and blocked out the sunshine and killed most of the plants, which caused a lot of the animals to die too, including all the dinosaurs. Even the marine dinosaurs died because the food in the sea did not grow for years on end. And so we know a lot about the past, but we don't seem to be able to get people to understand that this is a cold period in the history of the Earth. You know, you speak of the coral reefs, that the story back in 2016 was 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is dying. 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is nearly dead. 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is practically dead. 93% of the Great Barrier Reef is in its final terminal stage. That was in Forbes, as if there are other terminal stages before the final one. But you can see that none of those say dead. Practically dead isn't dead. Almost dead isn't dead. Nearly dead isn't dead. Terminal stage isn't dead. You're still alive. So they got away with that and made people in the whole world think that 93% of the coral reef was dead. When this year they finally had to admit, because of pressure from people who are saying, hey, you guys, you can't keep lying about this forever. There are people out there who are measuring how much coral there is in aerial photographs. So you've got to tell the truth. And this year they told the truth. And the truth is there is more coral cover on the Great Barrier Reef in 2022 than there has been since they started measuring it 36 years ago. Now, that's not very long ago. Think about the Great Barrier Reef and all the other coral reefs in the world in the context of the fact that during the most recent glaciation, peaking around 20,000 years ago, the sea was 400 feet lower than it is today. The whole world's oceans were 400 feet lower. Since then, the sea has risen 400 feet, obviously, if they were 400 feet lower then. The coral reefs existed then when the sea was 400 feet lower. They have grown 400 feet deep in order to keep up with the sea rising, the living part of them. The part that's down so low that there's the other corals on top of it every year, it kept growing. But the sea really stopped rising about 7,000 years ago, coming out of that glaciation. If you look at the curve, it's a very steep curve until about 7,000 years ago, and then it pretty much levels off. Now, I personally believe that over the last 6,000 or 7,000 years, it's just been going up and down a few feet in these warming and cooling periods. During the Roman warm period, the sea was definitely at least a meter, 3 feet or more higher than it is today. And then into the medieval into the Dark Ages, which was a cold period, the sea went down. And then it came up again in the medieval warm period, and then it went down in the Little Ice Age. And now it's rising slightly around the world, a couple millimeters a year or so. The two things I say about the sea level rise that people are all scared of is you won't have to run. It simply isn't rising that fast that you would have to run away to get away from it. It's like glacially slow. And the second thing is, if you want to protect your property from the slight sea level rise, hire the Dutch. 25% nearly of Holland is below sea level. And that's where they grow the most food in all of Europe for export to the other countries. So they have taken land that is actually below sea level and recovered it by building dikes, and now are making food there. I want to talk about dirt for a minute, because I was talking about how green fossil fuels are, but the way they denigrate fossil fuels and put them down is they say they're dirty. The dirty oil, the dirty coal, right? What do they mean by that? Dirt is where we grow all our food. Something wrong with dirt? No, but it is dirty. There's no doubt about that. So they're using dirty not to say that something's poisonous. They're using dirty as in dirty, rotten scoundrel. In other words, they're using it as a swear word. Because what does dirty, rotten scoundrel mean? That means that's a bad person, right? So they're using it as a swear word, as an epithet, as we would call it in Latin, I suppose. That's not fair. To give our kids the idea that fossil fuels are dirty fuels when they're not. What do they mean? Like natural gas certainly isn't dirty. It's invisible. And oil, the gasoline you put in your car, if you look at it, it's not dirty. Now, you could say that coal is dirty because it's black and it can blacken your fingers if you rub it. Same with dirt, though. You don't want dirt on your pants, but you do want dirt on your farm. On a farm, dirt's a really good thing. So dirty is not really a bad thing. And yet they get away with saying that fossil fuels are dirty. And it's true that when you burn things, you can cause smoke if it's not a complete combustion, whereas the plants that are built today to consume fossil fuels are pretty much complete combustion. So it only makes sense to try to be as efficient as possible with your burning. The truth of the matter is, the Greens, as they call themselves, are actually against fire. They oppose burning anything. Well, they say it's okay to burn palm oil, I think, like and corn oil. I don't know why they say that, because they're afraid they're against every other kind of burning. One of the kinds
ethanol.
Yes, yeah, but one of the kinds of burning that is really successful is waste to energy. The United States and Canada each put more than 50% of their solid waste from their houses and their buildings into landfills, where it's a complete waste and causes toxic drainage, etc. Whereas in Europe, where land is too expensive and precious to use for landfills, they build waste-to-energy plants and get 4% of their total electricity from waste. So what they do is they recycle about half their waste, the waste that is suitable for recycling. But there's lots of organic waste, paper, plastic, and wood, that is not suitable for recycling. Pizza boxes are the classic case for paper. But wood that's from demolition, short pieces of wood full of nails, who's going to recycle that? That gets burned, and they can even recapture the steel from the nails. It sinks to the bottom in a little cup, and they recycle the steel. I mean, most of the metal and glass is recycled already in one way or another, but it's the combustibles that end up in the landfill. China is building the world's largest waste-to-energy plant now, But the reason there are very few waste to energy plants in North America is because the Greens are against them. Because they say I don't know what they say, but it's the way to go for all the non-recyclable combustible materials in our waste stream can produce a lot of energy in the form of heat and electricity. There.
I wonder what might be the Greens' agenda on preventing wasty energy plants.
They go on about
that. Like,
they call about the emissions. They act as though there's toxic emissions coming from them when they have state-of-the-art emissions control, just like our fossil fuel plants do these days. They're just, as I say, it appears as though they're actually against combustion of fire, of burning things.
Very interesting.
And their whole approach to forest management, they're claiming that climate change is causing the forest fires. Well, I don't think so. It doesn't get hot enough for a tree to just burst into flames spontaneously. First off,
get dry.
Forest fires are largely caused by trees. And so let's start there. They're caused by wood, mainly made by trees. And if the wood is dead and laying on the ground and builds up over the years because no management is being applied, and that catches fire in a hot day in the summer when the wind is blowing, bang, you've got a massive forest fire. That's what's happening. In the United States, the western lands west of the Mississippi, there's a huge area of federally controlled land. National parks, national forests, Bureau of Land Management. Idaho, for example, is 70% federally owned. So the state of Idaho does not control 70% of its own land base. It's managed from Washington. Most of the politicians at a federal level are east of the Mississippi, where there aren't a lot of forest fires, largely because it's broadleaf trees in the north in particular, and in part of it in the south. But even in the southeast of the United States, where most of the timber is cut, in the states from Florida to Texas, there's very few forest fires there because they manage their forests to make sure there aren't any. But in the federal lands of the West, where they have basically eliminated forestry, so therefore there's no income from those lands to do any management, and the so-called green politicians in the cities back east think it's just fine to leave them alone. But if you leave a forest alone like that, it's going to have a buildup of dead wood. The native people in both North America and Australia used fire in the spring when it was still moist and cooler and no wind was blowing, and they burned off the dead wood. Or they collected it for firewood for themselves. And before our use of fossil fuels, people in every town would go out and scour the forests around the town for the dead wood for their heat in the winter. And that ended with fossil fuels pretty well. There's still some people who do that, but not many. So that has really changed the nature of the interface between the human population and the forest around them. Because if you go and clear away all the dead wood every winter, every fall for the winter, you really reduce the chance of a massive fire next year. And the Aboriginal people in Australia had what's called the fire stick, where they went around to forests where there was a buildup of dead grass and limbs falling dead down on the ground, and burned it off in the spring when it wouldn't become a catastrophic fire. And that made the forest itself less susceptible to catastrophic wildfire. So these things are not being applied properly, and they're blaming climate change for it, and, well, everything else too, it seems.
You know, Al Gore's 2006 film, An Inconvenient Truth, it's one of the top grossing documentary films. I know for certain, you know, it's touched me personally at the time when I watched it. And I remember shifting my habits. I would spend a ton of money buying organic. I stopped eating meat because guilt makes you, that emotion kind of makes you write a check. What is the agenda behind these kinds of movies, these kind of quote, i.e. environmentalist films? I just kind of feel like the whole world is buying into this, anti-human movement. Like, it's our fault. I mean,
Yep.
I read Ishmael. I remember I read Ishmael by Daniel Quinn, and I was 15 when I read the book in the 90s, and I said, oh, humans f***ed up. It's our fault. And now it's a big mess because of us. When did it become our fault? How do we then get away from that stigma?
It's been going on for a long, long time. They were still burning witches 200-300 years ago in the United States, right? And they picked on women who were not capable of defending themselves. Virgins were thrown into volcanoes in order to make the weather better so that the crops would grow. All through history, this kind of guilt trip has been laid on people as if it was their fault that the weather was bad. And this climate change thing is just another case of that. Like, if you look at the burning of witches, it coincided precisely with the Little Ice Age when crops failed and people were starving. And that's who they took it out on. They took it out on women. Apparently there was something about if you throw a woman in the water and she sinks, she's a witch. It's only if she floats that she gets to live. But they did those things. And they tied them up to stakes and burned them with wood underneath them. So and this was only a short time ago in human civilization that they were still doing things like that. And the atrocities that have occurred through the ages are unbelievable. And we tend to think that now we're more civilized. Well, look at Ukraine. I thought that was over, but maybe it's never over. I don't know. All we can do is try to stop it and be as civilized as we should be. But I think this kind of using fear and guilt to control people has been going on since the beginning of time. We are a social animal. We have leaders and followers. We have workers and, bees and queens and all those kind of things. And so that leads to a situation where it's possible to abuse your authority in a leadership position. And it's been done over and over again through history. Just look what's happening in the world today. I'm a Canadian and I'm embarrassed to death about our leadership here right now. We have a child prime minister who said he was in favor of emancipation for women and then fired a cabinet minister who was not only a woman but also First Nations or Aboriginal because she was doing her job. He fired her. She was doing what she was supposed to do in a legal case against a corporation that was tied in with the prime minister's circle. So this is the kind of thing that's been happening forever, and it's up to us to stop it and fight it as hard as we can. And right now I'm seeing what I hope is the beginning of the house of cards coming down. And the realization that this whole net zero and the squad and all that ultra left stuff and BLM and everything, that is just not the way to go. I hope people are seeing that, because I'm straying into, of course, the larger political domain here, but the whole environmental issue and the whole climate change issue is part of that larger political domain and is being used politically rather than scientifically. This is one of the worst periods for science in the history of science. It's worse than what they did to Galileo. And it is worse than during the early Soviet years when Lysenko controlled agriculture and created all these collective farms, the starvation that occurred. Not many people know about the terror famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s, when there was a crop failure, but Ukraine produces the bulk of the grain in that part of the world. Russia imposed rationing on the Ukrainian people, and between 3 and 8 million of them died from starvation in the early 30s. So that gives you a little bit more perspective on the relationship between the Ukraine and Russia, because those orders came from Moscow. back then. And people's grandparents and great-grandparents were involved in that. And how many people in the United States know about that? Look it up. It's in Wikipedia. And Wikipedia says 3 to 5 million. Some people say 5 to 7 or 8 million. In other words, it's the Ukrainian equivalent of the Ukrainian Holocaust, as they call it themselves, because it's like in the same magnitude as the number of Jews that were killed in Germany. Only they were killed in a different way, but death was the final result. So it for me, I just learned this 2 days ago. I'd never heard of that before, but it is true. There's no doubt about that. And we just don't get, stuff is withheld in a way. You'd think that the major media might have mentioned that at some point during this crisis, that's part of the history of Russia and Ukraine. But they did not, and do not to this day.
You said that you were on Walter Cronkite back in the early days when you were with Greenpeace. I mean, how has the media changed, and like what kind of that had to be just an awesome experience to actually be on the show with the famous Walter?
Well, I wasn't personally on the show. It was him reporting on our being arrested by the Coast Guard in Alaska. We had gone into a port. Our captain was friends with all of the native people up and down the coast. That's where he tended to stop and visit. And Akutan is right at the beginning of the Aleutian Islands, going out to the west further. And we went in there, and he introduced us to the Aleut people who live there. And of course, we didn't go through customs because there is no customs in Akutan. And the Coast Guard showed up in their big shiny Coast Guard cutter and came aboard. They anchored, and as soon as they came into the harbor, actually, John Cormack, our captain, had a great sense of humor. He pulled up the anchor and started steaming up the inlet full speed. Well, it was a dead end. It's like a dead end canyon because it's an inlet. But he pretended he was trying to get away from them, and then he got up as far as he could go there and dropped the anchor, and they followed us, and they anchored, and they lowered a launch, and the captain of the boat got in the launch with about 6 or so crew members and came over, and the captain boarded our ship, and our captain knew what to do, stay in his wheelhouse where he belongs. And so the Coast Guard captain went up the stairs, up the ladder to the wheelhouse to read the riot act to John. We were under arrest and must return back, go back. You can't go forward anymore. And but the Coast Guard crew handed us this crumpled up piece of paper. We opened it up, and it read at the beginning, if it were not for these military bonds, we would be with you. The whole crew, except for the captain, signed this thing. When they went back to their barracks in whatever island they were based on, they got punished by being confined to barracks or whatever they did. But we gave that story to the media, and Walter Cronkite used it on his evening news. This bunch of Canadians out there in the middle of nowhere in the Aleutian Islands protesting against a hydrogen bomb. And so we took on the world's most powerful organization, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, and won. And that was the beginning of a really successful series of campaigns that changed a lot of what was going on in the world, and especially changed a lot of people's minds. And it's true that many movements become corrupted when power and money become involved. And that's just as true for the United Nations and the World Economic Forum and Greenpeace as it is for, through history, I'm sure. But there are generally some independent people who try to stay on the path of truth and righteousness. And I hope I'm one of them.
What is the message to the younger generation to find this truth?
Well, I would say the first thing is to remember that life is sacred, and that includes human life. And I mean sacred not in a church way, but in a way to how you should feel about it, how you should consider the fact that this is a miracle, that we are here, and we should try to do something useful with our lives. And critical thinking, I say a sensible environmentalist bases their opinions and policies on science and logic. It's not good enough just to have the facts. That's the science, or the facts. The word science is being misused these days. They say that those of us who question the hypothesis that humans are responsible for the slight warming that has occurred over the last couple hundred years, they say we are science deniers, climate deniers, climate change deniers. These are common terms that are used. Don't listen to anybody who uses those terms, because it's not real. We're not denying anything. We just question some of the things that they say are absolutely real, like, show me what the CO2 is doing. Nobody can do that. It's invisible. And these are very complex scientific questions. You can't just be a regular person and think you know all about climate change. It is a big subject, and it includes many, many factors which are all operating simultaneously and affecting each other in ways that we don't know. You see, one of the main things about climate change is there's more we don't know about it than what we do know about it. We know it changes. We know that part because we can measure things, but we don't know why these cycles are occurring in many cases. For example, the glacial cycles through the Pleistocene Ice Age appear to be associated with what are called the Milankovitch cycles, which is the effect of Jupiter's gravitational field on the Earth's rotation and circuit around the sun. I mean, I go, are you sure that Jupiter could do that from, like, it's this little tiny thing out there? But the cycles are in sync with each other. The cycles of the ice coming and going are in sync with Jupiter's position in relation to the Earth. And that is a fact. How it can possibly do that. But on the other hand, we do know that Jupiter has some small effect on the tides due to its gravitational force. The moon and the sun, of course, are the two main effects causing the tides. But Jupiter has an effect too, and they can actually calculate it. So don't think you know everything. That's another good piece of advice. One of my favorites is when it says, the baobab trees in Africa are dying, and climate change may be the reason, right? May, that word. May, might, or could. You should always say may or may not, might or might not, could or could not, whenever you see those three words. Because may does not mean will. It means possibly. But when you say something is possibly going to happen, that means it's also possibly that it's not going to happen, possible that it's not going to happen. So these are all aspects of critical thinking in which you basically apply logic to the facts and to the way people are expressing themselves. Is that a logical statement to say climate change may be the cause? You haven't learned anything there. They're not saying they know it has. They're saying it might be. What does that mean? You know, those are really important, those points. Well, again, the meaning of the word green, for example, as I've explained it throughout this discussion, people just think green means good. Well, no. Oh, and red means bad? I'm not sure that you can do it that way. Those are just colors. So you can't just take a color and say this color means everything that is good. Even if, like, the weather isn't green as a color. So what does it mean to say something is green? It means pretty much absolutely nothing. And so get a better word. And don't call wind and solar renewable when you're talking about the machinery. That's where the big cost is. It takes 100 times as much concrete to build wind farms to produce the same amount of electricity as you can in a gas plant. 100 times. And with all of these materials that are needed for all of these technologies that they're saying should happen, there isn't a single decent feasibility study, either economically or technically, to show that this can be done, what they're saying. Net zero, no fossil fuels, no nuclear. They don't like hydro dams either. So we're going to use batteries to back up the wind and solar, which means we'll have to produce 75% or so, maybe at least 2/3 of our electricity will have to be from batteries, which have been charged by wind and solar. So when do you charge the batteries then? You can't charge the batteries when the wind and solar aren't working, which is about 2/3 of the time between the two of them. So you have to charge the batteries when the wind and solar are also supplying all the needs of the whole city and industry, which is what a coal plant would be doing, or a gas plant, or a nuclear plant, or a hydro dam would be doing. Is at the peak, they have to supply all of it. But if the wind stops and the sun isn't shining, say at every night, for example, and when the clouds come over, there's nothing there. So that's when you need the batteries. So you have to have charged them while the wind and solar energy was working and also supplying the whole city. So now you have to have at least 3 times as much energy generating capacity from the wind and solar as you did from the reliable technologies. And that's going to cost at least 3 times as much. And now we still haven't bought the batteries, though. Now we have to buy the batteries to supply about 2/3 of all the electricity in the world. So it is impossible. There's no question of that. Read Mark Mills, Mills, Mark Mills of the Manhattan Institute. His recent papers in the last 2 or 3 years on the feasibility of using wind and solar as our primary source of electricity. You will see it is impossible. He's got the numbers. He's got them down. But all these people, especially politicians who don't even know what a battery is, you'd think that batteries produced electricity to listen to them, but they don't. They store electricity. You first have to produce the electricity and put it in the battery, and that's not 100% transfer. There's energy loss that happens there too. So in order to get 100 megawatts of energy into a battery, you have to maybe produce 120 or more megawatts of electricity. So the whole thing unravels very quickly, and it is a house of cards, and it is going to fall down soon. And people will have to come to realize that the path that we're on right now in the West, Russia, China, India, South Asia, Africa, they're not doing these things. They're increasing their consumption of fossil fuels and of nuclear energy. Russia, India, and China are all 3 of them building nuclear plants now. Many nuclear plants. Read about it. Russia's amazing fast neutron plants are breeder reactors on the Caspian Sea. It's got 2 now. It's building a 3rd bigger one. Those are recycling the used nuclear fuel from commercial reactors of the kind that are mostly in the world. But that's a 1 cycle. And then they store the spent nuclear fuel, which still has 96% of the energy in it. As a matter of fact, nuclear energy is basically limitless on the face of this earth. There is so much of it that we do not have to worry about running out of it like we do with fossil fuels. And that's why I believe in reducing the use of fossil fuels and increasing the use of nuclear to replace.
Do we have to worry about nuclear disasters at all, or?
No, we don't have to worry about nuclear disasters. The only nuclear disaster that has happened is Chernobyl. 3 Mile Island was a non-event. Nothing happened. A reactor melted because of a mistake that was made in the reactor, but it didn't cause anybody any harm. It was just an expensive accident. Fukushima was really a comedy of errors. First, they built 4 of the nuclear plants in a place where they knew that tsunamis had come in the past. Second, the backup generators were sitting on skids in front of those reactors near the ocean, where they were washed away immediately. And that ended the ability to cool the reactor core, which you have to do after you shut reactors down. Those reactors were shut down as soon as the earthquake happened. But they also lost off-site power, in other words, from the grid. So they had no electricity there to run the pumps with. So they had their backup pumps, which worked just fine, except they got washed away by the tsunami. And then, days later, as the hydrogen built up inside the protective enclosures over these reactors, they knew they should breach those enclosures and let the hydrogen out with a small amount of radiation. And they were told not to by the president or prime minister or whatever, prime minister, I guess it is in Japan. In North America, the reactor operator tells the president or the prime minister what they're doing and goes ahead because they know what to do. In Japan, apparently the prime minister has to be the one to make the final decision. And the final decision was made, no, don't do that. Don't let any radiation out. It was a very small amount. So they all blew up, one after another. One day after another, those things exploded, and that explosion went down into the reactor core and destroyed it even more. So that was really stupid, too. They did about 5 stupid things in Fukushima. That won't happen again, hopefully. And all the other reactors have been operating. Like in the United States and Canada, there's over 100 reactors operating for 50, 60 years without even harming anyone. No one has been injured by them, never mind killed. So they are really safe. If you look at the gas and oil industry, people get killed fairly regularly there by explosions and falling off drill rigs and whatever. Even in wind and solar, people fall off the wind turbines while they're working on them and things. People die. It's not that many. But in nuclear, there really are no casualties because it's very stationary. It's very, very stable. You know, and it's not rocket science. Well, of course it is in a way. It's a nuclear reactor. But they're not difficult to run. It like the people who are in the submarines and the Navy ships and the nuclear icebreakers and the big nuclear plants, they are basically just technicians. They don't have to know how to build a nuclear reactor. They just have to know how to run one. And there's really good instruction manuals for that. So as I say, it's not like any more difficult than running any other large piece of technology. It's all understood and worked out, and they know what to do if they need to do something. So we should be embarking on a massive build of nuclear plants around the world. It doesn't have to be done like as if it's an emergency. Just let's get going on this, because there's a good reason to conserve our precious fossil fuels, and the nuclear is the answer to that. And the people who are scared of nuclear, I just don't get it. But that is why they took my name off the list of founders of Greenpeace in 2007, is because that's when I came out strongly in favor of nuclear energy finally. This is like 20 years after I left Greenpeace. My name had been listed as a founder. And now they say I played a minor role in the early years. That's how they describe me. I was one of the founding directors of the thing. I was a director the whole time. I was a founder of Greenpeace International. I negotiated the arrangement with the other people in the organization to create Greenpeace International. I became a director of Greenpeace International for 6-7 years, and then I quit because I just couldn't take it anymore.
And you're the only member that actually had any scientific training during those 15 years there as well.
Well, it's just a fact that most of the people who rose to political leadership in Greenpeace were more like political activists or social activists or entrepreneurs. By the time I left, you could make a good living in the environmental movement. today, I believe the top guy in Greenpeace is probably making $300,000-400,000 a year. And that's not unusual in those larger groups. They're competitive in their salaries, and maybe it's $500,000. I don't know, but whatever it is, they're doing just fine. And therefore, you become entrenched, and you don't want to listen to any alternative positions, especially if it undermines your fundraising base. And if Greenpeace was to admit and recognize that there is no actual scientific proof that our CO2 emissions are the cause of the warming in the modern warm period, what would they do for a living? Maybe get an honest job for a change. But it's a total shame the way it's gone. But that's happened in history a lot. Look at countries like Venezuela, who were doing okay, and bang, they're totally corrupt. And people, I think 20 million people have fled from Venezuela because it can't support them anymore, because they have destroyed its economy with socialism. I'm not against social programs. I'm not against social period, but I'm against, I guess, what a lot of people would call communism. But that doesn't mean I'm against communes. Words are used in ways that kind of put you in a corner. Because I could say, oh, well, yes, I support free enterprise and free speech. I don't know about whether I should say I should support capitalism. What does that mean exactly? Any more than I should not support being communal. So the words in politics are, to a large extent, propagandist terms. And therefore, I'm very careful about that. I try to stick to science. But on the other hand, I know that the science is useless unless you have policy that's based on science. And policy is about politics. It's about decisions. And that's why when people say there's an overwhelming consensus among scientists about climate change, consensus has no place in science. There's no important discovery that has been found by a committee. Science doesn't work by committees or boards. It works by individuals. If you go back to Galileo, to Darwin, to Newton, to Faraday, to Einstein, and I can rattle off a whole bunch more, those were all individuals who made really important discoveries and said, hey, I think I found an important discovery. And then other scientists looked at it and said, yeah, it works for me too. That's the way science works. It's about finding cause-effect relationships mostly. And that weren't obvious because there's so many things going on. And a big part of science is trying to eliminate all the other factors from your study than the ones you are looking at to see if does this cause this, or is it the other way around? Because you mentioned Al Gore's movie, Kai. In that movie, he shows the graph of the glacial cycles. And he says, look, temperature and CO2 are virtually identically coordinated with each other. They follow each other. Therefore, the CO2 must be the cause of the temperature. They're so closely related. When in fact, it's the temperature that's the cause of the CO2. He's got the cause and effect mixed up there. The reason the temperature affects the CO2 is because when the seas warm, they emit CO2 into the atmosphere. And when the seas cool, they absorb CO2 into the ocean. And that results in them following the temperature, CO2 following the temperature curve. And we know from the ice cores in Greenland that the CO2 actually comes after the temperature. And the cause never comes before the effect. Sorry, the effect never comes before the cause. I get those mixed up too. But this is the way he got to say that temperature is being caused by CO2, when in fact CO2 is being caused by temperature. That is not in dispute, yet they will not talk about it. I want someone from the climate change movement to come to me and show me that in fact it's the other way around, that the CO2 is causing the temperature, when in fact there's an 800-year lag from when the temperature changes till the CO2 changes. And that's why I was saying the effect never comes before the cause. It's always the other way around. My favorite cause-effect relationship has to do with ice cream consumption and shark attacks. They are in perfect sync with each other. Now, which one is it? Do shark attacks cause ice cream consumption, or does ice cream consumption cause shark attacks? And of course, the answer is neither. They are each caused by a third factor, which is temperature. Because when the temperature goes up, people eat ice cream and go swimming and might get eaten by a shark. When the temperature comes down in the winter, people don't go swimming and don't eat ice cream. And they follow each other perfectly through year after year after year. But it's not a cause-effect relationship between the two of those things. They are each caused by a common third factor. And that is often the case. And that is why science is about tweezing out which are the real components of a cause-effect relationship. And if you want to get a laugh, there's a website titled Spurious Correlations, which show the correlations between all kinds of crazy things that are obviously not a cause-effect relationship.
How do we spell that?
Spurious, S-P-U-R-I-O-U-S.
O-U-S, okay.
That's something like that.
My brain's exploding.
Good. That's
really comes to a crazy realization here that the human emotion is so easy to exploit. And guilt is one of the heaviest emotions there is to extract.
Guilt plus fear.
Guilt and fear.
Yeah.
And so I certainly drank that Kool-Aid when I was younger. That's for sure. And so it's interesting now that seeing a little differently, you know. But gosh, Dr. Patrick Moore, thank you so much for joining us today for 2 hours. This has been an epic conversation and mind-blowing information that you've given us. I hope you will come again in another discussion.
I will. I'd be happy to.
Holy crap. How was that conversation? Definitely mind-blowing. So much information to absorb there. But my friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. If you got any value from this episode, please subscribe and hit that like button. It does help us out in the YouTube algorithm so that we can continue to bring more content like this. And also, our goal is to hit 100,000 subscribers. And once we hit 100,000 subscribers, Jesse and I are going to get married. So we will stay engaged until 100,000 subscribers. But thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you on the next episode.